first off, thank you, Kaye, for joining SheLeads. I'm very excited to have you on the show and get to know you better. So thank you for joining.
I am delighted to be here, and thanks for the invitation.
Of course. So first, as a little intro, you are currently the Senior Advisor and Executive Coach at BCG, so one of the top consulting firms in the country. But before you even did that, you held senior positions in HR at a lot of in the pharma industry. So Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, Onyx Pharmaceuticals. So before we get to BCG, I'd love to get to know that a little bit more, kind of how you got interested in the pharma industry, and more specifically, why HR? What led you to HR?
Sure. So look, my story is the story of an immigrant. I came to this country, I was 19. Wow. I had probably about $50 in my pocket and a lot of dreams and a vision.
Yeah.
And at the time that I came here, there was this perspective, and I think it's true, it still remains true despite the obstacles, that if you have grit and resilience, you absolutely can carve out a life for yourself here. And I'm really clear to tell people that I was not fleeing from persecution. I was not a refugee. Okay. I really came of my own free will, but it was really driven by this dream that I had for a life that was bigger than the island. I grew up on Barbados. Wow. So I came here, and like many immigrants, those first couple of years were very, very difficult. Yeah. And I will tell you that a lot of the lessons that I now put into practice as a leader, as a mother, as a community activist, many of those lessons were learned in those 2 years that were very, very challenging. There were times when I had to make a choice between eating and rent. And, you know, I'm smart enough to know that rent generally ruled out. But that grit and determination that started early on, I didn't start out saying I wanted to be in HR or I wanted to be an entrepreneur. I started out saying I really wanted to understand business from the inside. I really wanted to understand what caused an individual to start a business. Why were some businesses successful and others failed? Yeah. And I will tell you that over the years, the one denominator has been leadership, because you can lead your way out of just about everything. Yeah. You can't manage your way out of many things. You can't force your way out of many things, but you absolutely can lead yourself in an organization out of just about every single thing you find yourself in.
Wow, that's incredible.
I ended up then, my first corporate, if you will, role was I worked for a company called Dun & Bradstreet, and we were, in those days, the Yellow Pages directories were still a thing. Okay. So I started out on the ground floor. I was actually someone that you would call and place an order for placement in the directory. Okay. And I went to school at night. I went to the City University at night. I was a night student, and I worked during the day. And after 4 years, I got my degree. And I had been deciding all along that I wanted to keep going because I was learning the technical aspects of running a business, operations. I was learning how to actually go from an idea of actually having someone call and place an ad to actually getting it placed in the directory. I was understanding distribution. Yeah. But the part that I felt was missing was really the understanding of the financial underpinnings of how a business runs. How do you bring all the pieces together in an integrated way? And that led me to pursue an MBA at Columbia. So I went to Columbia, did an undergraduate degree, and was set to go on. At that time, consulting and operations management was very, very much what every individual coming out of Columbia was doing, that or finance. And one of my classmates one day said, would I ever consider HR? And she was at Pfizer. Okay. And funny story, I thought Pfizer was the faucet people. So I said to her, I can't imagine what I would do working for a faucet company. But what she said to me, which was compelling, was, we don't look to hire HR people. We look to hire leaders who are interested in business, and we train them in the technical side of human capital management. And that was very intriguing. So I went to work for Pfizer, and I started out in the manufacturing plant where the company started 150 years ago. And the reason for doing that is, again, I wanted to understand the business from the inside out, from the ground up. After there, I was recruited to Johnson & Johnson, And after about 18 months working in their North American area of consumer,
Yeah.
I was promoted to be the chief HR officer for the company and one of the 7 people that ran the company.
Yeah.
And that was probably the highlight of my professional kind of corporate career. And then I left there and became really intrigued about growth, because like many big pharma companies,
Yeah.
Johnson & Johnson was really dealing with the challenges of growing both the top line and the bottom line, and dealing with not having as robust internal innovation coming from R&D, despite pretty significant investment. So I got intrigued by smaller companies and smaller growth companies, and a CEO friend of mine recruited me to California, and I went to work at Onyx. We built that company, and Amgen came a couple of years later, and we sold the company to Amgen. It was acquired by Amgen for about $10.5 billion, one of the largest acquisitions at the time.
Yeah.
And I spent a year helping to transition the business, and then I evolved to what I now have, which is a portfolio career. So that's kind of how I ended up where I am.
Wow, that's an incredible story. I love it. So clearly leadership is ingrained in you. You have those leadership qualities. And I'm interested, where do you think you get that from? Is it in that time when you were struggling to put food on the table and when you were choosing between rent and food? Or do you think you just learned kind of as you took on a new role? How did you get that?
I think it's a number of things. From very early on, my mother, who has passed on, would tell you that I was always organizing things and people. Yeah. I was the brownie leader. Yeah. I was the Girl Scout troop leader. There was something that I was drawn to, organizing people and resources and getting things done. So there's a part of that was innate, I would say. I'm drawn to having structure and systems and processes. I really think at the systems level. So I think there's a part of it that was innate. I think my parents encouraged that in me. That was not something that they actually discouraged. They actively encouraged that in me.
Yeah.
And I've always been intellectually curious about the science of leadership. And I think historically there was a lot of focus more on the tools and the techniques.
Yeah.
And I think now what I'm starting to see more of is actually the science of leadership. And that's what I'm really curious about. So how do we bring neuroscience to think about leadership, right? How do we really now have it be exactly what it is? It is an enabler. It is a driver. It is fundamental to business success. It's not the thing you do in spite of, all of the other busyness of life. It is actually fundamental to being successful.
Interesting. And you think, kind of on your research of the science of leadership, you think that it is something that can be learned and people can practice that grit, getting that grit to become a great leader?
Absolutely. I mean, it's so interesting because the reason I talk about grit and resilience is when I think about the experiences that I have had, that I've had to go through to really build my career, I think about my children, for instance. My daughter's 18 and my son is 20. And when I often think about how do they build their own capacity for resilience and grit, given that many of the early experiences that I had that really enabled me to dig deep, to go into those places are not necessary for them. So we are actually, interestingly enough, talking about that right now. My kids, this is really the first tough, if you will, challenge that I think not them, but your generation is really facing. And it's not just the economic component, because if you think about 2008, that was really economic. There was not the overlay on top of that of a pandemic.
Yeah.
So they're really dealing with a multitude of challenges. And my aspiration for this, and for all young people, for all of us, quite frankly, is that we're able to find the gift in the pause. And that's when I'm talking to CEOs that I'm coaching. I'm really saying to them, if you thought about this moment as a gift, what is the gift in the pause? And the gift may just be the pause, right? I'm saying to them, don't architect it and make it too much. Because as you know, So much of leadership is about reflection.
Yeah.
And we have not practiced the art of reflection. And leaders grow and learn when they're able to reflect. And that's why I think this is a gift. Look, I'm not minimizing the tragic circumstances that it is, but that's what I've been thinking about. What is the gift in this pause for me as a leader, for me as a parent, for me as a human being on the planet?
I love that perspective, because I think another big factor that is so challenging with this COVID-19 and this pandemic happening is this whole idea of uncertainty. We don't know what tomorrow will bring, next week, next month. So it's almost like taking that pause, but also how are you coaching leaders and CEOs about dealing with this uncertainty where it's like, I don't even know what will happen, so how do I act upon it?
Yeah, so I like to keep it simple. So there are two things that I talk with them about, apart from actually the gift of pause is one.
Yeah.
The second is something I call compassionate urgency. And what I mean by that is everybody right now, particularly leaders, are focused on urgency. And I understand that. That's about, you know, if you have to lay off 60 to 70% of your workforce, which I just helped the CEO do, there's a certain urgency about that. If you are planning to go IPO and the market just is not the same, there's urgency around that. If you have investors that are pressing on you, there's urgency around that. But what I'm asking them to do is to step back and think about, how do you wrap that urgency around compassion? So thinking about the implications and the impact for the people that you lead. So there's not a company that doesn't have a value statement, that doesn't have a mission, that doesn't have, you know, an aspirational culture. How are those things serving you now as you navigate through this uncertainty and ambiguity? So the gift of the pause, compassionate urgency. And then the last thing I say to them is building the bridge to the future. Because you have to look, with all the uncertainty, building the bridge to the future, the very assumption is that there is a future for you and for the company. That future might look very different than it is today, but how can you do some scenario planning that helps you say, what are the sets of possibilities? And what then are the implications for each of those possibilities? And you've got to be clear about the future that you aspire, in spite of the ambiguity and the uncertainty. You still have to have some sense of the future that you're aspiring for. And then what I ask them to do is do 3 work streams. One work stream is purely financial, and everybody is focused on the financial work stream, which is, what do I have to do for liquidity? How do I preserve capital? How do I deal with all of the ways in which I can manage my cash burn? The second is operational. If I am, whether I'm in retail, whether I'm in biotech, whatever area I am, sector I am, how am I dealing with the operational realities of the fact that my business is dramatically changed? The third that people often forget is people, right? And what are you at every single one of those dimensions? How are you dealing with the employees that you have? You may be thinking about furlough. You may be thinking about layoffs. You may be thinking about reduction in force. Whatever it is, how is that consistent with both the operational and financial work stream that you're running? And also having this sense about the future for the employees that you lead. Because we are going to come out of this, right?
Exactly.
We absolutely are going to come out of this.
So it's interesting because your second one, compassionate urgency, and also with their last one about treating the employees, it's so true in terms of when you're laying off people. I've learned in class, actually with Bob, about how we have to fire gracefully and treat them like they're humans and help them find another job, because you never know what will happen. Maybe they'll come back or you have no idea. So I think that relates very well.
And it's also innovation. It's a space for innovation. I'll give you an example. So I chair the board of trustees of Glide in San Francisco. And Glide is, you know, we are on the front lines of the homeless crisis. We, prior to COVID-19, we served close to 1 million meals every year. And we have about 3,000 people that come to us every day for help.
That's amazing.
And those numbers have multiplied within the last week or so. And we were really facing a crisis around how would we continue to deal with the tsunami of need that was coming. And in a really innovative, I would say an innovative response, there's a company called Gate Gourmet, and Gate Gourmet does all of the catering for airlines. And they face the possibility of a layoff in some of their big hubs like San Francisco, Chicago, and Atlanta because of the reduction in airline traffic. Yeah. And there is a really innovative collaboration that has come together where they've been provided funds to keep them open and keep their employees employed and working. Right. And they're providing meals for us in San Francisco at scale, like 15,000 meals, so that we can quadruple our capacity. Yeah. Employees remain employed, protecting their families, and it enables us to continue to do what we need to do. To me, that's the innovation that's really called for in these times.
Yeah, because they're still working. Everyone's still like they're benefiting so many things at once, and that's being innovative. They're not kind of succumbing to what's happening and just
exactly.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's awesome.
Exactly.
So kind of shifting gears, I'm wondering. You told me about how you were an immigrant, and it was definitely hard, kind of rising. Have you experienced any of those barriers kind of going from company to company where you felt, okay, because I'm a female, that this is like, I have to do even more to overcompensate like their perspective of me? Kind of how did you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, so perspective and context really matters here because I came of age in corporate America at a time when I would say 90% of the time at the levels that I was at, I was either the only female or I was the only woman of color. Yeah. The second thing I would say is I worked for about 8 years across Japan, Asia, Africa, Middle East, and Latin America. So when you think about, 15, 20 years ago in those geographies, I was absolutely the only woman, the only woman of color, and many times the only American or non-local person. Wow. So absolutely, I faced all of those at just about every juncture, and to a certain extent still do to this point in time. Yeah. I think the difference is at that point in time, I think some of it was back to the point I made about the resilience and grit. Yeah. Was it would have been, given what I went through to get to where I was, the notion that anyone would define me as being either less qualified, unqualified, or that there was a better alternative than what I offered to the table was just unacceptable to me. Yeah. And I would say I always led with my competence. And to your point, absolutely over-indexed. I was always over-prepared. Yeah. I was always, I over-indexed on performance. I over-indexed on preparedness. And some of that, I'll give you a little story. When I was first in the U.S. as an immigrant, I, like many immigrants, worked cleaning bathrooms, cleaning homes. Yeah. I mean, that was what immigrants do when you first come here. Yeah. And I remember one day calling my mom. I was just, I don't know, it was just a really low moment. And my mother said to me, and I'll never forget, she said, the only thing that soap and water doesn't clean is sin. So you just need to get back to work. And it was such a vital piece of, at the point in time, it was just a reminder, right? Yeah. It was just a reminder of the long game, right? And I always use the analogy of the short and the long game. Yeah. Because I find so often that we play the short game, right? Yeah. But we forget that how you win is playing the long game as well. Yeah. And that's been a piece of advice that has really stood with me. I tell the same thing to my kids. I tell the same thing to leaders. That's what we're talking about here in COVID. Exactly. Think about it. Yeah. Everybody's playing a short game. And I said, we can only win if we play the long game and the short game. We can't just play the long game because it's the distinction between survivability and sustainability, right? And yes, we need to focus on survivability, but sustainability is what will get us through.
Yeah, I love that piece of advice because it's so true. I feel like not only even leaders, just employees, it's so easy to get wrapped up in the short game and just be like, oh no, this is what's happening now. What's going to happen next? So I love that. So shifting, so I know you, as a mother of two, Jasmine and Jordan, how was that balancing motherhood and being such a great leader in these top companies? kind of how is that balancing, and has it shifted throughout the years as they got older? Did it become easier? Things like that.
Yeah, I would say initially, look, I am enormously blessed. Like many people, I have an enormous community of family and friends and deep faith. Those are my 3 F's. Family, friends, and faith are really what enable me to get through. And in those early years when I had young children, very young children, I was still traveling 70 to 80% of the time.
Yeah.
And the only way I was able to do that was because I had a very strong, supportive family network that did that.
Yeah.
I will tell you that I don't live life in regrets, but the one thing that I talk particularly now with young women and young fathers about is really ensuring that they are clear about who they are in the moment and how their job requires them to be in that moment. Because in the early days, because I had the support system, the balance, there was no such thing as balance. My priority was my job, but I knew my kids were well cared for because of my family.
I see, yeah.
But I will tell you, I'll give you an example. 4 weeks after my son was born, I was in Turkey leading a meeting with 3,000 people. And I'm really clear to tell people I would never do that today, and I would never ask anyone to do that today. And I think times are different, and I'm really happy that times are different. I use a lot of my past experiences to counsel, particularly individuals who are early in career, who are starting out. I also push companies to really push for. And I don't talk about balance. I talk about integration.
I see.
I think balance creates a false binary. Because balance implies that it's going to be somehow precise.
Right.
It just isn't precise. What's really required is creating systems that allow people to live integrated lives. And then the last thing I'll say, as an HR professional, we have been trying for 20 plus years to move to flexible work arrangements, remote work, and all of those ways that we could use technology. We did it overnight. What does that tell you?
I know, it's possible.
It's possible. And so for the last 20 or 30 years that we've been encountering resistance, resistance hasn't been real, but I also believe the readiness is all. So, maybe COVID was the readiness we needed.
It's true. I was actually talking to my family that COVID has almost brought families together, and these working moms are now having a chance to be with their kids when they're growing up. And I don't know, it's interesting. It's kind of what you said. Now it's like forcing this work from home, and maybe this is a new reality, or I don't know where it's going to shift, but it is interesting to think about.
Yeah, and what's interesting, back to the point about talking with CEOs and leaders about what I call reentry. People say rebound. I don't like that word at all.
Okay.
I talk about reentry. And when I talk with them, I said, if all that happens when we get the all clear to return to work is that you open the doors and invite employees back in, then we would have squandered this opportunity. And the real question is, who are you as a leader through this process? What have you learned? And how do you want your company to be different? Because people will be different. I talk with them about the reality of you have to accept that there will be people who have been traumatized by this experience, who may not want to come back. They may not want to leave the safety or the perceived safety of their home.
Right.
We may have now created a normative way of working, which is completely virtual. So really asking them to be thoughtful about, as you think about reentry, what does that mean? Looking at the way work is done, right? Because one of the big barriers to remote work historically was we would not redesign work. And we are redesigning work. We're redesigning organizations. We're redesigning communications mechanisms. So the whole notion of work is being not just disrupted, it's being redesigned real time. And unless we decide we're going to redesign it again in a month or two when we end up going back to work, I don't know. I think we would have squandered the opportunity. So that's where I'm really spending a lot of time asking them to think about that. Because I think that will absolutely help people who are balancing, whether it's parents, whether it is children, whether it's preferences, right? It could also be preferences.
Yeah, and it goes back to what you were saying, how it's so important to be innovative during this time. Because it kind of goes back.
Absolutely.
Like once it's all over and everyone returns, are you just going to go back to your normal? Because I don't think that's going to be possible because things are going to be different and it's going to take time to adjust. So it's very relevant. Yeah. So for the final 2 fun questions that I have.
Sure.
First of all, I've loved this. Thank you so much for being on SheLeads.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. Thank you for doing this.
Of course. So one is, what is a passion or hobby that you have that isn't related to your work?
Wow, there are a lot of them, but I'll tell you 2.
Okay.
One is reading. And my daughter, I share that with my daughter. So we take reading vacations.
Oh, wow.
We will go on vacation and sit somewhere and read. We even share the same books. So we have a good laugh about that. We do good reads together.
Mm.
And then the second is I climb mountains. That's what I love to do.
Oh my goodness. So first, what is your favorite book? And then what is your favorite mountain that you've climbed?
So I'll do the favorite mountain first, Kilimanjaro.
Okay.
Hands down. Not just the summiting, but the journey and the process and everything that went along with it. One of the most extraordinary things I've ever done in my life.
Wow. Okay.
Truly. My favorite book. Wow. That's hard. I mean, I've never met a book I didn't like. That's part of the problem.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I'm always reading. I love to read.
What's the most recent one you've read then?
So I'm reading George Takei, who, as you may be aware, him and his family was interred. He wrote a graphic novel describing his family's process of being rounded up and interred. Oh. It's fascinating. Okay, and I highly, highly recommend that.
Yeah.
And then there's another one. I always get the title wrong, but On Earth We Were Briefly Gorgeous, I think. It's just a beautiful, beautiful book.
Awesome.
I mean, I could go on because I really do love to read. I have a ton of them on my, I do both Audible and reading. I'm listening to and reading Americana.
Wow.
Which I love as well.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Okay, and then the final question is,
yes,
what is a fun, weird talent that you have that no one else really knows about?
Fun, weird
I'll give you mine. Mine.
Yes, please.
So I'm weirdly good at catching grapes or blueberries into my mouth when I throw them at a distance. So I'll give you a little preview.
Please.
So here's blueberry.
Yes.
Okay, let's see how this goes. Oh no. I'm going to have to go again. I'm going to go again. One more time.
Under pressure.
Exactly. There you go.
Wow. I'm impressed. No, I can't do that. That's for sure. That's absolutely for sure.
Thanks.
Weird talent. I mean, you know, I have my second toe is longer than my first toe.
Okay.
So I can wrap my second toe completely around my first toe.
Oh, wow. That is pretty cool.
That is very weird.
Very weird. Well, I love it. Well, thank you so much, Kaye. It was
you
so
welcome,
great talking
Carly.
to you.
This was delightful. Thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you.
Take good care.
Thanks.
Be safe and be well.
You too. Stay safe and healthy. Bye.
You too, my dear. Bye-bye.